Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we continue to roll through our Masterpieces of World Lit class here. Pardon me, and I'm just checking through our due dates, and so I'm recording this on Monday, the 17th today. So, I do my best to keep up with where we're going here, but obviously we move pretty quickly, so sometimes I miss units in terms of these sorts of things. So the unit that we've just completed is the middle period following our midterm essay, which is an odd coincidence. There's not no relation between the two, unless you did very poorly on the midterm, in which case it might have been like a Dark Ages for you, but I don't think anybody did. Anyway, one of the major things that we looked at in terms of the middle period is, it may be even a term that you're not necessarily familiar with, is to really rethink how often that particular period in history is referred to or figured or framed as the Dark Ages, largely because of what had occurred before it and then, of course, after it with the Renaissance. And so it ended up being this, again, middle period that grew to be defined in as much as you can define a period that's so broad in scope and geography, as this period of sort of intellectual stagnation and cultural stagnation and just not a great time period. It does point to one of those funny things about sort of the academic or the historical approach that we take to things and how we sort of impose structures on long spans of time or particular literary periods, for example. And so from this vast diversity, we try to pull out certain characteristic examples, which really does a disservice to the thing that we're studying, whether it's a literary period or a cultural or historical time frame, but it's just a convenience for us to make things kind of make sense relative to one another. And so the middle period really suffers because, of course, it has to live up to these sort of cultural high watermarks of whether it's Greco-Roman culture or that Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance that followed. But of course, again, you try to think of it in very practical terms, like if somebody from that time period could discover now what time period they lived in according to us, and it's like it would really suck to end up having lived in the Dark Ages. Your life could have been great and you might have read books and enjoyed whatever, but it was the Dark Ages, so it's like, damn, why couldn't I be lucky enough to live in the Enlightenment? That sounds so much better. Even the middle period, which is we think of as a step sort of forward or a step better than the Dark Ages, but it's just like, you were sort of in the middle of these other really interesting time periods. So tough luck on that one. But anyway, the point is really, very broadly how much of a convenience these naming or labeling devices are, an academic convenience, even though they really can color the way that we think about a time period. But if you know that a work is from the Dark Ages versus, let's say, the Enlightenment, which is actually something we'll be picking up in the next unit, think of how much that colors the way that you approach this. Like, wow, it's pretty good for the Dark Ages. Or, man, this wasn't very interesting at all, although it was from the Enlightenment when there was lots of other interesting stuff going on. So think of the context of all that kind of thing. We did, however, having said all of that, get the opportunity to run into what I think are some really interesting works, and ones that might in fact be familiar to people if they weren't already in name, but because they've been reimagined in these very 21st century terms. So Beowulf, for example, is, there's a film version, and so film is not necessarily a 21st century kind of a thing, clearly. But if you've watched the trailer, maybe even saw the movie, you'll know that it's one of those very creepy-looking computer animated, but not entirely computer animated kind of situations, which is obviously a very 21st century sort of a thing. So that very ancient story gets reinterpreted in this very dynamic and futuristic kind of medium. It doesn't make it better, that's not what I'm saying, but it makes it different. It reflects maybe some of our contemporary cultural ideals, even if the story itself doesn't change, but just in terms of the way we participate with that story. it changes. And then I'm just kind of clicking myself around in our course here, and it takes a little while to get where I want to get to. The other interesting one is probably already familiar to you, at least in name, from Dantes Inferno. The reinvention here, and I realize that the screenshot that YouTube provides is probably, if it didn't draw your eye, then I don't know. Anyway, the video game, Dantes Inferno, the video game, and in fact, I've never played it myself. I do like to play video games, but I rarely have the time to learn like all of the crazy things you've got to learn to have any fun playing games. So I like relatively simplistic games, and I always set them on super easy, I ain't gonna lie, because I'm just interested in exploring the world, not in like getting all of my fingers to work at the same time, working all those buttons. Just, I don't have the time for that. So anyway, that little caveat. But I have, despite not having played this one, I have watched a number of the trailers and walkthroughs and stuff that you can find online. There's like a whole culture of people immersed in these video games. It's really fascinating. And I don't mean that facetiously. It actually is fascinating. But what I'm also really interested in, I think particularly as a teacher of World Lit, which is such a challenging thing to teach if you haven't taught it yet, but if it's in your future somewhere, you're going to run into some really, really interesting but challenging questions about like how deeply do you get into things, how do you even define world. A term like masterpieces is just like all kinds of baggage goes along with that. Anyway, all of that aside, one of the most interesting contemporary mediums that I think is the place where things like masterpieces of World Lit are being reinvented, or where future masterpieces might be most likely to be written. I'm not sure that they've been written yet, but I think video games, honestly, they offer, because of the computing power that we now have, it's such a kind of dynamic vehicle to tell not just these visually stunning things, but these narratively interesting things as well. And Dantes Inferno is not a very good example of that. In fact, 95%, if not more, of video games are still really just a lot of fancy packaging and cutscenes and trailers, and then it's just like another first-person shooter or button masher where you just smash all these monsters to bits, which Dantes Inferno, from the look of it, ends up being. I think they try to layer this other storyline on top of it where you have to choose to save souls or damn them and whatever. I don't know how involved that is. I think it's mostly just mashing cool-looking monsters. But it's certainly cool to look at this interpretation through this very dynamic visual medium of what is really a pretty visual story, a lot like Milton's Paradise Lost, if you've ever run into that. It exists in this really text-heavy way in the poem itself, but in many ways it's like an epic movie just waiting to be made, or a video game just waiting to be made. These huge, like, visual spaces that the narrative unfolds in, that are so much, especially in this one, a part of the story. So what, if you know anything about Dante's Inferno, it's probably the levels of hell. So you'll notice that the geography of the place it's not just related to the story, it sort of is the story in a lot of ways. It's a very geographical kind of poem. And so what better medium than the movies? But even that it's sort of this static thing in the sense that we can't really interact with it and move around in space in it, whereas video games do allow for that. Okay, lest I appear like really, really dorky and out of touch. Like I said, most video games, despite the degree to which they might take advantage of that visual dynamism, they don't produce very interesting characters, narratives. They tend to, at worst, reinscribe all of the oldest like gender stereotypes that we sort of weeded out from those 80s cop shows that some of us grew up on. They never went away. They just went to video games. That's where you can find them now. So all that being said, there's a lot of kind of bad video games out there, even though they look cool. But I think there's some that are unfolding, whether it's like a World of Warcraft kind of a thing or the Halo series. that there's obviously gameplay in there, but there's also these really elaborate narrative structures that make everything kind of make sense. In other words, you might be just mashing a button for a while, but you're doing so as part of this larger narrative. And like I said, I'm not sure that one of the masterpieces of World Lit has been written for this genre, the video game. But if you're young enough and in this course and looking towards a career in education where you might teach this course, I don't know, 5, 10, a little more years down the road, I wouldn't be totally floored if one of the masterpieces of World Lit took video game form, to be perfectly honest. Again, it might seem a little hyperbolic at this point, but it seems to be a direction, or that possibility is out there. So I'll leave it at that. And again, this is one of those interesting debates that then you'll have to take up as a teacher of these things, is how you manage, at least, and again, our example is good. If there's a video game of the thing, do you then still read the thing, and how do those two things relate? So do we move away from those text-based texts and into some other medium? And you can already hear the debate, oh no, kids don't read anymore, and they're just going to stop, they're going to lose the ability. On the other side of that, which I tend to move myself that direction, is that rather than destroying our connection to texts, the original texts, I hope they would motivate our reconnection to some of them. And I really like I've watched some of the developer stuff that the people who worked on Dantes Inferno, the video game, talked about, and they addressed this quite specifically, is what is the relationship of this game to the original text. And they were quite frank about, you couldn't just take the text and make a game out of it. There has to be some game to it. There has to be some interactivity. Otherwise, it's a terrible game. It's not fun. At best, you're a character who has to follow the storyline, one given storyline. And you have to interact with everything the way that the character from the text does. And clearly that's not a game. It really becomes just a movie that you're not part of, and not a very interesting one. But by the same token, it's not like these guys just sort of knew about the text a little bit. From what I can tell, and I have no reason to think that they're lying about this, is they really did, as a development team, from basic animation, visual people to story development or game development, that whole gamut of people, that creative team, really dove into the text, which is pretty formidable, and really thought about its relation to the game on an ongoing or unfolding basis. Again, I don't think the game as a video game is particularly good necessarily, or it doesn't break any ground that we haven't seen treaded already, where you're just sort of smashing monsters. But it does represent, a creative team working very specifically from the text and trying to imagine that text in a new, in some ways, totally different kind of medium. So I think the potential's there for something really great to happen from original texts like the Inferno here, or Paradise Lost, or Beowulf, for example. But I think video games in that medium also provide the opportunity for some really inventive new kinds of storytelling. So that might be part of, at some point, the masterpieces of World Lit. There you go. I'll just throw that out there. If it ever happens, it's on video or whatever this actually is. So I've actually said it. And if it doesn't happen, then we don't even ever think about it. Okay, the phone's ringing. That must mean I'm done. So keep in touch. I'll talk to everybody soon.